Last week, Pittsfield District Court Judge Thomas Estes resigned from his post one day after the Supreme Judicial Court ordered his suspension. Estes had admitted to having a sexual relationship with a woman who worked on a team that he oversaw. He said it was a consensual relationship, and she disagreed. The Berkshire Eagles' Bob Dunn joined me in the studio to discuss.
This began sort of suddenly last August when Judge Estes was, without a lot of explanation, reassigned from his duties as First Justice in Eastern Hampshire District Court in Belchertown, as well as the Pittsfield Drug Court. And,
which is the court that he helped to launch, or he was the sitting judge when it began.
Right, yeah, that began, I believe it was in October of 16. And he headed it up until he was reassigned in August. And as it turns out, the reassignment was in the wake of a discrimination complaint by Ms. Tammy Cagle, alleging a physical relationship between the two. And her claim is that she was eventually lost her position as a clinician with the drug court after she tried to end the relationship with Judge Estes.
And so basically alleging retaliation by the judge against her.
Right, and he denies that claim.
And so the result was that last week the Supreme Judicial Court came back and said that they were going to sanction the judge and that he would be suspended indefinitely. Right. And then one day later, Judge Estes chose to resign. Correct. But as far as you know, is it rare for the judicial system to weigh in on one of its own this way?
I don't have those exact numbers, but it's my understanding that this is a pretty rare situation. I think there's only been a handful of times that a disciplinary matter involving a judge has gone to these lengths. Yeah.
And the court itself, as I read in your reporting and the reporting of others, the court itself can't remove him permanently. That would require either an act of the legislature or the governor. And the governor said that the SJC decision was, quote, a pretty good start. So do you think that Governor Baker would have pushed to have him, or the legislature pushed to have Judge Estes removed?
That's certainly what it sounds like there. I mean, now that he's taken that step to actually resign, it's speculative whether it was going to go that far, but based on the governor's comments, it certainly sounds like that was certainly on the table, if not the intention.
Yeah. And so Mr. Hoos, Mr. Estes' attorney, David Hoos, had argued in court that the court should sanction the judge over the sexual relationship with Cagle, but allow him to remain on the bench. How was that argument received?
Mr. Hoos and Judge Estes offered up a few different alternatives to the suspension, including public censure, a public apology, reassignment, adhering to a prohibition to not work in any of the state's specialty courts, which would include the drug court, and a shorter term of suspension, perhaps with a set end date or something like that. So all of those were suggested by Judge Estes and his legal team, but the SJC apparently decided that the behavior was egregious enough that it warranted this indefinite suspension without pay.
And Mr. Hoos really tried to argue in favor of his client, not surprisingly, but he said, quote, "He has not sinned so severely as it should cost him his career. He is not only a good judge, he's a superlative judge. He's an exemplary judge." You know, what was the sentiment among his peers that you heard about while he was working in the court?
People I spoke to in the courthouse and among the staff liked working with him. Professionally, I've had occasion to speak with him very briefly on a couple of occasions, and he's always come across as very pleasant. And Mr. Hoos is correct. He's received exemplary judicial evaluations. The SJC, even in their decision, noted that he's received very positive reviews. I think Mr. Hoos went so far as to say any other justice in the state would probably be very pleased to have the same types of reviews that he's received over his career. And he's a relatively young man. I mean, he was looking at up to a 20-year career on the bench up until the mandatory retirement age.
Because he was tapped by Governor Deval Patrick back in 2014, so he hadn't even been on the bench that long.
Right.
But the SJC made it very clear that Estes' behavior, they found it inappropriate, and they said, quote, "It was willful judicial misconduct that brings the judicial office into disrepute." What's the reaction been from the legal community? It's a very tight-knit community.
Right. I haven't heard a lot of initial feedback aside from, again, just disappointment that things had gotten this far, and just really lamenting that somebody with a a promising tenure on the bench had to end their career this way.
Yeah. And so Tammy Cagle, in terms of how she met Judge Estes, is she considered a direct employee of the court because she worked for kind of a third party, right?
Right, and that sort of adds an interesting sort of facet to the civil suit that's pending in district court right now. There's some question of whether Judge Estes was in fact her employer in the sense that it would need to be to apply to the civil suit. But yeah, she was a clinician. I believe she worked directly for Behavioral Health Network, and yeah, she had that role in the drug court, and that's the position that she was released from at some point. And again, her contention is it was a result of her trying to end the relationship with Judge Estes.
And again, the judge has denied that particular claim. He said there was a relationship.
Yeah. Both sides have stipulated to certain facts in the allegations. There's no denying that there was a relationship and other details that came out in the complaint. So there are two separate things. There's the SJC's reaction to the fallout from the relationship and the inappropriateness of it and the judge's behavior in that matter, and then the civil suit that's pending on whether or not this constituted sexual harassment in a hostile work environment and so on.
Has this whole situation opened up any discussion about the rules between whether it's an employee or a third party and a judge? Are there rules that prohibit any sort of sexual relationships between a judge and an employee or a judge and a third party?
I think the same as most workplaces. I think it's at the very least discouraged and frowned upon. And I think in this dynamic, somewhere in the SJC filings, it noted that judges are one of those positions that your behavior is held to a higher standard. So I think the inappropriateness of the relationship in general, compounded by where some of these encounters occurred, including the judge's lobby on occasion and things like that, I think all of that taken into consideration is what caused the SJC to land where they did on their decision.
Estes resigned from his position, but this isn't really over for him, right? He's still pursuing another angle of this?
Right, yeah, the civil suit is still pending, and the most recent action in that was filed in early May, and seeking to have his name removed from part of the suit, again, contending that in this context, he can't be considered Ms. Cagle's employer and as such can't be liable for her dismissal.
Great. Well, Bob Dunn, I appreciate your reporting, and Larry Parnas's as well from the Berkshire Eagle.
Larry's done a ton of work on this, and so thank you for mentioning his work as well.